There it is.
Good morning. This is St. Mark's in Glen Ellen, and today is Pentecost Sunday, May 28th, 2023. 19. I'm Joyce Fletcher. I'm going to facilitate today's discussion, and we can, for the multitudes watching us at home, we can introduce ourselves.
I'm Edna Hetherington.
And I'm not muted. I'm Laura Waterman. Nice to see everybody.
And I'm David Fletcher.
And Laura, you're going to share the
Yes,
slide.
I am. I just realized I was on the wrong one. My apologies. Okay.
So during the past 6 weeks, we've been kind of dipping our toes a little bit into the Sacred Ground curriculum. As we've said multiple times, the Sacred Ground curriculum, although designed to be a 10-week series, really has enough stuff in it for it to go on and on and on forever. But we've really only touched the surface on a lot of things. So we've talked about, we talked a little bit about privilege. We've talked about what it means to be white. We've talked about Indigenous history in America. And we've talked about Latino history in America. And what else? Oh, the different views from a spectrum of people who identify as white, political differences, religious differences, and so forth. So, you know, this has been just a little brief thing. I think that probably we'll come back and revisit different aspects of Sacred Ground as we go through our adult formation program. But just from the little bit we've had, I thought we could talk about where do we go from here? What do we do? So if we go to the next slide, we can see that the Sacred Ground really came out of, I'm going to move that so you can see it better. The Sacred Ground really came out of the Episcopal Church program called Becoming Beloved Community. And it was visualized as a labyrinth. As in a labyrinth, you're not just always walking forward to get to the middle. You're walking forward, you're walking back, you're walking a little around. And, you know, the reality of our lives is that our movement isn't always forward. It is more labyrinth-like. So and the labyrinth is divided into 4 quadrants. So when this was designed, the 4 quadrants on the left says telling the truth. So that's the truth-telling quadrant, which is telling the truth about our churches and race. And that's what really a lot of the Sacred Ground has been about, is like, let's look at the truth, not what we've been told all our lives, but what is the truth about race and about our churches. And then the next area is proclaiming the dream of proclamation. And the dream is the dream of becoming beloved community. So when you hear beloved community, what do you think?
I think of Michael Curry.
Mhm. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, when I moved to Baltimore, Michael Curry was director of St. James Lafayette Square, which is among Episcopalians, a famous church. And he was one of the best known preachers in Baltimore, where there's actually a whole culture of events around preaching, sponsored by the theatrical people, the Roman Church, which reaches out to its Jewish community in Baltimore, who's federal meetings, and everybody else that gets included. So there would be preaching events. You go in an evening to a very big synagogue that has a huge hall and have 4 different preachers preach on some remarkable topic.
Like approximately what year was your years?
I lived in Baltimore from '89 until 2008.
Okay.
And during that time, Michael was elected bishop in North Carolina, right? With the 2 different dioceses.
Uh-huh.
He was the diocese that could tolerate a Black person being the bishop. And at that time, well, he is presiding bishop after Jeffrey Shore, who was very interesting presiding bishop. But he is the one who I heard talk most about the loving community. Not only since he's been presiding, but before that. But I think it was Martin Luther King who was first talking about the beloved community of Barack and Son.
So what do you think beloved community means?
Well, it means they will know we are Christians by our love, right? It's
Okay,
founding principle.
pretty simple then, right? Yeah, so then that's kind of at least our ideal of proclaiming love and letting, and that people will see Christ in us.
Well,
Because
you
of,
know, monastic life was the source of the list of 7 sins, which, as far as I was able to find the history of it, started out as egregious writing about 8 bad thoughts that bothered a monastic community trying to live together in peace and constructive behavior. And of course, those were celibate all men communities. But I started looking into that a long time ago because I noticed that although there was this list of sins, it's not biblical. It's not something you find in the Bible. It's developed later. And it's about, but it's like things that are in the Bible. I mean,
Right.
it seems to me that the whole story about Moses leading the people is about trying to figure out how to become a community. And it's the same thing when you start putting monasteries together and everybody's living in close quarters and
yeah,
living through whatever.
yeah, and you know, that like thinking of that, like today's Pentecost Sunday, and in the Acts, you know, in Acts 2, it talks about, you know, okay, Pentecost came, the Holy Spirit came, people spoke in tongues, whatever. But then they went about sharing everything they had with each other. So they became a community, right? They created
Yeah.
community, which I think has always appealed to me about the early church, is that
Well, it feels to me about the church.
Yeah.
Because the church, a long time ago when and I've often spoken of this, I went to the University of Chicago for college. And at that time, you start out with Plato and Aristotle, and there's a whole bunch of philosophy stuff in it. And I don't take very well to most of it.
sorry, David.
Well, yeah, that's where we differ.
But I realized I also was the College of Chicago at that time had a remarkable number of Jewish students because it was a rigorous, intellectually known college that did not have a quota on Jews. And so I was exposed to a good deal of Jewish talk and thinking. And then I married into Chicago Sinai congregation. I thought about my relationship to Christianity and religion, and I thought Christianity has philosophy, there's a philosophy that's ethic, basically, about how do you live your life. And then it also has opera, it has performance, art, and music. And it's like the difference between symphony or jazz quartet and going to the opera. And I prefer opera.
Okay.
There's a lot of story, there's literature.
So just like if we move on through this quadrant, oops, no, I go back one. Because we talked about the truth telling and proclamation part of the labyrinth, and that's really what the sacred ground is focused on. But what we're going to talk about today, just briefly, is what do we do next? So we know these things. Where do we go from here? And so the other two parts of the labyrinth don't get a lot of talk in the sacred ground curriculum, but it's kind of what are our next steps? So formation is just what you were talking about, and practicing Jesus's way of healing.
Figuring out how to get along in the community.
Right, how to get along in the community, how we live our lives. It's that ethics part that you said is part of Christianity. How do we live our lives? And then justice is, okay, now we've heard the truth, but what do we do about it? How can we as individuals or as a church go about repairing the breach in society and institutions? And I think that's a tough question. And, some of the things that we've done so far, one of the things that came out of the sacred ground groups was the land acknowledgement. So that's like a beginning attempt to look at repairing part of that breach. I think in our church, our local church, St. Mark's, our attempt to have a Spanish-speaking service is a step toward justice. I think to me, kind of a next step is how do we become more of one community?
Right.
Instead of two communities. We say we're one church, but how do we really live that out and make that happen? So I don't know, do you have any thoughts about your place in the labyrinth, or if this helps define kind of where we are headed to you?
This is good.
Can you see it, David?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I got my eye fixed.
I know, but he got his right eye fixed, but his left eye still is. He got the cataract surgery in his right eye. So,
My eyes are just going sort of vague.
so if we do move ahead now, we can advance the slide, Laura. So it's not enough to not be racist. We also move into what does it mean to be anti-racism. So that's kind of the action part. And so we're going to watch a little video here.
I'm sure there's a better way to do that. My apologies.
Oh,
Right.
if there's a better way, I have no idea. I mean, it's a link.
Where did
But
it go? It was right there. I had it right there. Where is,
They're slippery.
my
like that.
apologies. I had it right up and it was ready to go. And
That's why
now I'm,
It's in your hands so that you could be the one apologizing.
I'm trying to keep this crowd from getting
I
restless.
know.
oh yeah. Okay, Alt Tab. Here we go. And share the sound. Look at me with the share the sound.
Share it all.
Share. There we go. Oh, I have it muted. My bad.
Now, when I was growing up, I had friends from all different types of backgrounds. And I mean, race was something that we never really talked about that often. But there would be times where someone would say a off the hook kind of comment or make a joke that I thought was pretty offensive or out of pocket. And it became very clear that their parents or whoever never really talked to them about race. And I mean, I understand. Race can be an uncomfortable topic to talk about. But with the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black people over the years and decades, fired up protesters from all walks of life are leaning into that discomfort to speak out against police brutality and structural racism. And on the front lines of these protests are young people.
I'm here today because the Black future in this country is in crisis. It has been in crisis for a long time. The fact that people are still being killed with impunity by this force that is supposed to be protecting and serving us is absolutely unacceptable.
There's things in this country that have been set up since the institution of slavery that make it hard for Black people to be able to live comfortably and freely without having some sort of resistance or feeling like their life is being threatened on a constant basis.
There's lack of accountability. People aren't, being told what they're doing is wrong, and so it creates this ideology that what they're doing is okay, and that just perpetuates a system that puts everybody down,
In the wake of these protests, the term anti-racism is popping up all over the place. There's TED Talks on anti-racism, books about anti-racism are hitting the top of the bestsellers list. Even late night comedians are trying to understand what exactly the term means.
You also talk about the difference between not racist and anti-racist. Can you differentiate that for me?
But anti-racism isn't a new word. It has a history and was used by civil rights movements throughout the 20th century. And now it's making a comeback. So today, we're diving in and asking, what is anti-racism and what does it mean to be anti-racist? Before we tackle what anti-racism means, let's all get on the same page about what racism means. You've got in-your-face racism, where a person is prejudiced against another person because of the color of their skin. But it can also be more subtle, like not hiring someone because they have a Black-sounding name. But when that kind of prejudice gets baked into society, like it has in the US, you get structural or systemic racism, which is when a society is designed in a way that reinforces and perpetuates discrimination against certain races. You want an example? Well, here's an example. Between 2012 and 2016, Black males convicted of a crime received sentences on average 19% longer than white males convicted of essentially the same crime. Perhaps Black offenders don't make as much money as white offenders, so they can't afford good lawyers. Maybe Black people get judges that hand down stricter sentences. Maybe it's both, but that's the point. Society's been structured in a way that hurts Black people harder, and it largely stems from one of the darkest stains on American history: slavery.
Systemic racism is really coming out of racial slavery. And ever since racial slavery in this country, Black people were not necessarily considered citizens.
That's Peniel Joseph, a professor at UT Austin who specializes in civil rights history.
And so ever since, even after the end of slavery, systemic racism meant that Black people were segregated to certain parts of cities, like in Austin, Texas, where I live, but that could be Oklahoma, it could be Los Angeles, New York. They had less access to land in the South, but they had less access to getting businesses in the North and everywhere. It means that they're treated differently by the criminal justice system, by police, basically in all walks of life.
You know, in our conversations that we had with young people, a lot of it made me feel like they view racism and all these issues as if they live in this like bubble of the past, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like all those things you're talking about, like, oh, Black people couldn't go to certain places, couldn't do certain things. And it's like people kind of go, well, like, you can now, so what's the problem?
I think part of what is so powerful as a historian is narrative. And I think the narrative that we've told ourselves is that, one, we don't talk about racial slavery. So that's taboo. So shh about racial slavery. The other is that there was a woman named Rosa Parks who was awesome, and she refused to sit on a segregated bus. And then you had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who really was leading the March on Washington, but then he unfortunately was killed. But then you say Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and you have a Black president and a Black first lady, Michelle Obama, and you basically say that's the story of the civil rights movement in the United States, where there's a happy ending. We said we're post-racial, but then when we really look closer, we say we can see that we're really not post-racial. There's all these different things that are still unjust and unequal in our society, and this is connected to something much larger.
Rules or policies may appear race neutral, but in practice, They aren't. And that's true not just at the federal or state level, but at the local level too. Take school dress codes. It makes sense that schools don't want students to be distracted by revealing or inappropriate clothing, but the problem is what's considered distracting or inappropriate is really subjective and can end up reinforcing white norms. For example, do-rags, dreadlocks, and braids often get banned, which all affect Black students more. And when you look at the data around how school dress codes are enforced, that's what you see. Black girls end up being disciplined more harshly than their white peers. I know when I was in middle school and I had braids, I had to shave my head when I started at a new school. I don't know what that has to do with my learning capabilities, and I still don't know nearly 15 years later, but I did it. According to anti-racism, in order to address systemic racism, simply being not racist isn't enough. To quote Ibram X. Kendi, a historian and leading scholar of race and discriminatory policy in America, the opposite of racist isn't not racist, it is anti-racist, and that requires work. Emmanuel Acho, a sports analyst and former NFL player, went on Stephen Colbert and did a great job explaining this.
It's not enough in 2020 to be not racist. Not racist meaning I am passive when it comes to racism. That's what I mean by being anti-racist, Stephen. It's not just, okay, just because I don't say the N-word or just because I'm not scared of Black people. If you see it, you have to speak on it and call it out.
Anti-racism is an active state of mind. It's the active process of identifying and opposing racism.
Being anti-racist means also calling out racist policies in institutions and cultures that might not seem racist, but that are racist because they have a disparate impact on Black people.
Examples are everywhere. Voter ID laws that disenfranchise Black and brown voters, majority non-white school districts getting less money per student than districts with mostly white students, housing policies over the decades that have kept Black people in poor communities with less homeownership.
When you think about racism, there's kind of no neutrality. It's either that you're trying to constantly oppose it, or you sort of fall victim to being part of a status quo because we live in a society where there is systemic racism.
In researching this episode, I did come across some opposition to anti-racism as a set of beliefs. I'm not talking about people who don't think racism exists or who don't think it's a big deal. I'm talking about people who recognize that systemic racism is a problem, but take issue with the either or aspect that is at the center of the anti-racist philosophy. That you're either anti-racist or racist. There is no middle ground. So every conversation, every government policy is either explicitly working toward racial equality or it's actively working against it. This all or nothing approach has some critics comparing anti-racism to a religion, where any questioning of the philosophy is interpreted as an attack and can shut down questions and new ideas. Now, here at Above the Noise, we're not gonna tell you what to think. You gotta do that work and make up your own mind. However, if you're curious about what it takes to be anti-racist, here are some general steps. Step 1 is taking stock of any bias or prejudice that you may have and then challenging those thoughts. Personally, I've had well-intentioned white people say things to me like, "You're so well-spoken," or "You're so cultured." And in their minds, they're totally offering me a compliment, but it's definitely not a compliment. It's for sure an insult. But it's also important to understand that you don't have to be perfect to be anti-racist. I love this quote from Ijoma Oluo, a Nigerian-American writer. "The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward." Step 2 is educating yourself about how racism is systemic. It's about understanding what kinds of policies produce negative outcomes for people of color. We gave you some examples, so now you can't say you don't know what systemic racism is or that it's not a problem. And there are more examples to read up on and understand. Step 3 is taking action. At the individual level, that means speaking up when a friend says a racist joke or a family member uses a racist stereotype. In the moment, it can be easier to just stay silent and not rock the boat. But anti-racism demands you call it out and address it. At the structural level, it's thinking through how to dismantle racist policies to create new policies to help level the playing field. So, using the dress codes example we talked about earlier, maybe you educate teachers about stereotypes so they don't unfairly target Black girls. Maybe you ask students to write their own dress codes that reflect their values. Or maybe you just get rid of dress codes altogether.
It's a lifetime of work. And you can think of that as either good or bad, but you have to work on it. This is not something you do for one day or 1 week or 1 year. You have to keep it up and you have to bequeath that legacy to your children and grandchildren as well.
All right, folks, That's our dive into anti-racism. Now we want to hear from you. What are y'all already doing in your schools or in your communities to combat racism? Or what do you want to do? I can't wait to hear your answers. And before you go, let me tell you about a new PBS Digital Studio show that I think you're gonna love, Prideland. It's premiering on our brand new documentary channel, Voices. It explores LGBTQ+ life in the American South. Join host Delon Burnside, aka Ricky from the FX show Pose, as he recounts his own coming out experience and travels through the South to meet people breaking down barriers. Be sure to check it out, link in our description below. As always, I'm your host, Miles Best. Till next time, peace out.
So, is anti-racism something that you're familiar with? What? Sort of.
What is anti-racism? I missed.
You missed.
I did.
No, it's actively speaking out against racism where you see it, trying to do,
Actually acting.
putting action behind it, really. So instead of just saying, I'm not a racist, and I like the one quote that's, it's like, you know, you can be a racist and be anti-racist at the same
You don't have
racism.
to pretend to be colorblind.
Right. Yeah, so
It's
it's.
a colorblind crap.
It's getting out of just your head and putting action behind your.
So you have to put action behind it to prove that you're not a racist. Is that what
No,
you're saying?
no,
That's
no,
what
not-
I'm, that's what I'm hearing.
Okay, well, that's-
Prove it, huh?
No,
That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm.
Oh, no,
hearing.
it's saying, it's saying if you want to be an anti-racist, it means you're making a commitment to fight racism wherever you see it. It doesn't say that, and you could be a racist, you can still have, we probably all still have racist thoughts that come into our heads and, you know.
You didn't go to school in Mississippi or Texas, did you?
I did not.
Yeah, there you go.
Did you?
I did.
And what?
And London, where there was racism because we had a girl from Egypt, a Christian from Egypt, come to our boarding school. That was interesting. So, yeah.
Well, racism is everything, and, you know, I mean.
You know, and I was just, I don't know where I learned this. Because it wasn't from my family, but I can remember being in, we were on a military base, our school bus was driven by airmen, you know, and that was, they were in border pool and that's who drove our school bus. And one day our school bus driver was black, because we were going to our parochial school, which was white, which shared a back fence in the playground with public school, which wasn't white in Biloxi, Mississippi. And so kids in the front started singing Catch a Tiger by the Toe.
Oh, yeah.
But
But
Tiger was not the word
Right,
they were
right,
using.
right.
And I can remember we got that, because I picked with them, and all of a sudden we got there and I thought, I can't use that word. And I have no idea where I learned it, because it certainly wasn't from my family. But where I learned that it was wrong for me to say that word, I don't know where, but you knew it was derogatory. I did, well, I don't, derogatory was not in my vocabulary. I knew that it was not a nice word.
That it was hurtful to people.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
So I have no idea how racism or anti-racism is passed down.
Well, I don't think anti-racism is passed down. I think anti-racism is a
Well,
personal decision.
And I didn't tell you that, I was 5. I was 5 when this took place.
Right. Well, I had those thoughts when I was very young too, but I think the anti-racist, and a 5-year-old probably wouldn't do this, but an anti-racist would say to the others on the bus, you know, that's not a nice thing to say. And, you know, that would be a more,
little children.
so that would be like, you were good at recognizing that there's racism, although you probably didn't know that word.
Because
But
the only Black people I knew ironed out of women's clothes. It's the only Black people I had contact with. Right. They were not even the home. Because we weren't that lucky, but I can remember being at people's houses. Ironed with clothes, and when my mother died, you had some, in my house in front, and she was that. But I was, by then I was 12.
So
How
how
we
we
get
get,
to learn about it from feminism.
Right.
Remember things like that story about the surgeon can't operate on this patient because it's the surgeon's son.
right,
You know, it's a surprise because the people listening to the story are going along thinking the surgeon is the man. But the surgeon's wrong.
but it shows how our minds automatically
You are
just,
automatically
it's like, yeah,
thinking that surgeons are men.
So the lady.
And you're automatically thinking that laundresses are
Yeah.
men.
lady doctor as opposed to doctor, right?
The doctor.
But the way we got to this, talking about anti-racism, is that we were looking at the whole Sacred Ground curriculum, and that it's really the Sacred Ground curriculum the Episcopal Church devised is really looking at how we can tell the truth about what's happened in the past and proclaim the injustice that we're part of the beloved community. But the next steps are, what do we do? How do we put our thoughts and words into action?
Formation, justice. And then
So one of the things I think that stops a lot, I think there are a lot of things that stop a lot of us from taking action. And like, I know, I was talking to Marcy, who was involved with the land acknowledgement, and she did so much for it, but she also was like, there's so much I don't know. And I think that even that can sometimes stop us. Laura, can we go back to sharing the slides? So what are some of, so what are
Hi.
things that we say to ourselves to stop us from combating racism where we see it? Yeah, I live in Glen Ellen, we're not racist here, that kind of
Well,
thing,
it's going to come up about housing.
right?
Yeah, but that's my favorite response is I go to this church because it was when we started, it was the closest church to my house. It was 5 blocks from my house up in Washington. So I go to this church. And after about 15 years, I realized there was no black people. And there was a black lady that used to be there for a while, but she might have been the little in third class. She, and I can't even remember her name. And as soon as she graduated from high school, they were gone. So that's the only black people I've ever seen in this church as members.
As members. There was also a man who brought his grandson. I remember that.
I've seen the black person here once or twice.
Yeah.
And when Ida
But
was
there are
in the
black
office,
people
she would come
Yeah.
and bring her son.
Yeah.
But so
My friend used to come every Easter with her family, but that was not as a member, But also not a person that lives in Glen Ellen. Maybe part of it is that we're called to reflect, our, where we are too. I mean, there aren't a lot of black people, but if we can go on to the next slide. So one of the.
There are more Wheaton, actually.
Yeah, there are more in Newton. So some people feel like, well, I don't know enough yet. I need to read another book.
Just need to live in Biloxi, Mississippi, or San Antonio, Texas.
Yeah.
I woke up this morning thinking about books because I was just ordering something. I'm reading a murder mystery by Walter Mosley at the moment. And I was ordering books by Walter Dean Myers. There's a book of his that introduced me to him was his memoir of his boyhood in Harlem. It's called Bad Boy. And it ends with his enlisting and going to Vietnam, and he doesn't go on to that. He just says some things about learning something, and then he tells a little story about when he was back afterward, how he got into writing. The end of his, that particular memoir. And he's written thousands of books for, they're mainly, I think, aimed at young people. And where I encountered him was I went to the book fair in Baltimore, and I went to the children's tent, and he was talking to a group, and his books were among the books that were at the back of the tent, and that I picked that one up.
What was his name again?
Walter Dean Myers. And I woke up this morning just thinking about, I've been in some ways immersed in the actuality of Black life because I read books written by Black people. And I didn't think about I'm going to go out and read books written by Black people, but I do. They're among the good books I pick up here in Record.
They're good books.
And I recommended Black Boy to the book group, Bad Boy. And I think you found out that the Wheaton Library had a copy and that it was listed as adult, not young adult.
Oh, yeah.
Which I noticed. And
Well,
I thought about it.
sometimes librarians will do that as it's in the library.
Well, and then I was, because I was looking for another volume of his and ordering it, I was looking at these big lists of all that he's written. And one that I have ordered is about Vietnam, and it's one of the most challenged books on the ALA banned book list. And it's highly controversial, and librarians have to be careful with it. Things around it. I'm deeply in that. My daughter-in-law is a librarian. My niece is a librarian. You're a librarian. Josh is a librarian. And it's, the fun part is we just went through the capital dot thing because Julia was on the committee.
Oh, really? That's cool.
Yeah.
How cool is that? Very
Yeah,
cool.
we knew before anybody else what the book was.
Wow, that's very cool. Yeah.
So because we are kind of a reading group right here, it is easy to say, I just need to know more. I need to read another.
Well,
book."
you
Right now.
want to find out more about it
Right.
before you make a stand. You want to make sure that you understood the issue correctly.
Yeah, and yeah, I also think that could also be
As an excuse.
an excuse to.
Oh, yeah.
feel this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, I'm not denying that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Oh, no, I'm just saying, I can.
Yeah, well, and for those of us who really like to read, I mean, and there's always more books coming out, you know, when Theo Darden was here, what, 4 weeks ago, you know, he had a whole bunch of books. And David, you know, for Mother's Day, he bought me one of the books, you know, because then I can read more, and I know more about white people history.
I didn't want to get married until I read some more books about women.
Yeah, you should have waited.
But there's something beyond books that's happening right now, and that Kim Reed is active in this affordable housing.
Right.
Yeah.
And there is a bill in the US Senate and House to assist in reducing structural barriers
Right.
to affordable housing.
I read about
Lots of
that.
details on it. I'm writing some letters.
Yeah, I just read about that yesterday and, but it is so embedded, it's.
Oh, well, I've been.
But legislation is where.
City planning, you know, I have a master's degree in architecture and studied city planning. And it is highly segregatable.
Oh, yeah.
And it's absolutely dedicated to taking poor people away from rich people.
And are you say, you use the word structural, are you actually talking about building codes?
Yeah.
That people cannot afford, therefore it divides
well,
communities?
Terry Gross on Fresh Air just this past week had an interview with a guy named Henry Grabar, Grabar. He's written a book called Page to Paradise. And it's about how parking changes our world.
Yeah.
And I recognize this. If you build housing, there is something in your local code always that says every dwelling unit must be provided with at least 2 spaces for parking cars. Or if you're trying to house people that have just been brought in off the street, and you've got to build a facility for them or get them to a facility close to the train station, you're still required to provide 2 parking spaces for each dwelling unit according to code. So you need to change the code in some way. And in that interview, they mentioned, I think, oh wait,
It was in the
then
paper
I
this
read another interview written by him with the senator who introduced the bill. And
And which Senate are we talking about? The Illinois Senate?
no, the US Senate. And they talked about Seattle. And this is what they said, and I haven't gone back to Seattle to find out more details. In Seattle, they changed the regulations so that housing that was built close enough to a transit stop could be built without parking. There was no parking requirement for that housing. And what they found in operation was that developers reduced the number of parking places they provided because the developer is figuring out his market, and he figures out who he's building it for. But what was built that reduced the number of parking spaces that built with it by 40%. I think the statistic they gave. And then that also, of course, increases ridership on whatever the transit system is. And they weren't talking about this, but this is where I went on thinking about it because I think about city planning. Then it means that where the people go downtown or wherever they're going on the bus or the train, they aren't looking for a parking place. They ain't looking for a taxi.
Yeah.
Because our cities are not very well designed for transit.
Yeah. No, they're not. No, I'm thinking of Rob and not what sort of.
But portable housing, we can operate right now with our village.
Right,
And also over in Wheaton. My son happened yesterday to be talking to somebody who's interested in this. Housing.
Yeah, and that's actually, if we go through all these slides real fast, we'll get to that question. So some of the things we say to ourselves to stop us from doing things. I'm overcome with grief and shame. I can't move forward. I'm paralyzed, overwhelmed, and frustrated by all that's wrong and all there is to do. I think that I feel that way a lot of times, like there's, like, you can't do everything. And so instead of deciding on something you can do and directing, for me, directing my attention to the one thing I can do, I look at it all and become overwhelmed by it.
One of those poems is about a man who gets lost on a desert island. And he thinks about what he ought to do. He should find the helper, he should find a goat. All the things he read in Romans. And finally he ends up basking on the beach until he was saved. He did nothing but basking until he was saved. I think about myself, I'm just basking until I'm saved because there's so much here.
Yeah. I don't know where to begin. That's another thing we say to ourselves. So and I think surely there's nothing I can do that would be helpful. Thinking that we're not. So the reason I wanted to go through those is I have 2 slides here. How can we begin to address these issues here at St. Mark's? And then my next slide is how can we address these issues in the Glen Ellen area? And you mentioned the housing thing. And I was thinking about this and I was thinking how much I admire Kim Reed because she is a person who really, puts into action her convictions and beliefs. And so she's been so involved with the housing thing. And
Well, she helps the rest of it.
yeah,
You can call up Kim and ask what's happening.
Exactly.
And I do.
yeah,
I've done that.
yeah. And what about here at St. Mark's? What can we be doing?
Well, you know, you could ask a young man whose last name is Chavez if he wants to be on the list. I pointed out he was never, ever, has never.
Who?
My son-in-law, Javier.
No, he was
Or
on
Valdivia.
the, he was on the best room when I was on the best room.
Was he?
Yes.
Maybe that's because he raised a fuss, because he was, I remember him complaining that he had never been asked.
No, he was on the best room and I was on the best room. He was, and he was kind of in charge of communications. That was probably
When?
in the early 2000s.
Well, and then it was after, because he commented he had never been asked to be on the best room.
I know he was on it.
Well, thank you for correcting that, because that's always been a stone in my.
Yeah, no, he was on the vestry and he really contributed on the vestry and helped a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've never been,
What?
I've never been.
Well, maybe, maybe it's because your last name's Fletcher.
I was, first.
You were, yeah, like 60 years ago, you were on then.
But you were never asked, you just showed
I
you
just did
volunteered.
We could make our vestry more visible to the congregation because, and especially since, so many people in the church
Yeah.
are not Episcopalians all the way along.
Right.
They don't know that the vestry is really the center of the church. The rector
Yeah.
Right.
has to be called by the vestry.
Yeah, the other thing I think in our church, like I love that we started the Spanish language service. I think that we still are very separate. And I'm like,
Language is hard.
language and start.
It is.
But what are things we could do to help bring our congregations together?
I
Do
think
we
the-
need to?
I think so. I mean, I think
Do we keep them separate? And I'd say
We
that.
don't bring them together actively.
we do about 4 or 5 times a year in bilingual services.
We have things are there, they're sort of working. And then some friendships can develop it, especially if people are able to work together on something.
Well, I will tell you, language is a real issue.
It is.
Right.
Because I would just put the whole degree. We always need to get the whole degree. And we had people from one who wanted to do it. We worked really, really hard with them. And it turns out that whoever made our Spanish, we did the whole book in Spanish, the whole freaking book. Some of the translations were wrong. And then after a while, it's only Laura who's done, and she and a few ladies will bring stuff in. Sometimes they'll clean up, sometimes they just bring it in from the altar. And for a whole year, I came after that 1 o'clock service to clean up because there was nobody. But we found out it was language was a big issue, it's a huge issue. And you can talk all you want about learning a new language. It doesn't. I'm sorry, it doesn't work in this parish. Let me rephrase that. Because I do not live in a Spanish language community. And they don't live in English language community.
Yeah. It is really, language is a real challenge. And I feel guilt and shame about things is I feel badly that I haven't learned Spanish because it isn't, because I want to have more connection with the people in the 1 o'clock service. But then the other thing I feel guilty about that I don't do is I don't attend the 1 o'clock service. And I kind of feel like,
I thought we went to every service all the time.
well,
Yeah, I did think you lived here.
Yeah.
I blame you for why we don't go to the 1 o'clock service. Now speaking of other people I admire Kim because of her activism, but I really admire Peter and Virginia because they started regularly going to the 1 o'clock service and learned some Spanish and really made friends among people at the 1 o'clock service
Yeah, the trips down to Veracruz really helped the people that went because they were immersed in the language. And Kim is particularly somebody who made use of that. Because she can talk to people in Spanish. My son can talk to people in Spanish to some degree too, because he works with enough people that speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And has to trilingual medical.
I admire George that he
George
knew
really
no
went after
Spanish
it.
and now he can preach in Spanish.
And he went to that, he went that summer, he was 6 weeks in Mexico.
Mhm. We did that sabbatical.
And that was very good.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I feel like he has kind of put his money where his mouth is in terms of learning the language and knowing people. That's been difficult for me this year since I've been working with the youth program. So many of the youth that come to our youth night are from the 1 o'clock service, and most of them are very fluent or fairly fluent in English
As they go to school.
because they go to school, but they're parents. So when I have questions and I want to talk to parents,
You have to use the kids as a translator.
and they don't always get it. They don't know, you know how kids are like when you put stuff in their backpack, take this home to mom,
Yeah.
and it never gets to mom. Hi, Diane. Look at your pretty red dress.
You're sitting in the wrong place.
Why?
Because he has a sick one.
Oh, well, you
She's
know,
there to-
I'm the one that volunteered today.
And are you gonna talk? And you could say something good that I missed?
Oh,
This is
we've
wonderful.
been having a wonderful discussion.
Okay.
Hey, join us for the last few minutes.
I'm waiting for church to get out because I have all duties today. I haven't seen a single person.
Yeah.
Which made all the duty with the 3 baptisms.
So-
Be really congested.
So one of the things,
Yeah.
one of the things that came up last week, George and I met with parents of 6th and 7th graders to talk about confirmation. And, you know, we've had, ever since the pandemic, we haven't really done any like Sunday school or middle school and high school. We haven't had anything going on. And one person suggested having something at 12, so that we could get both groups at it. And, you know, so that's one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of church.
Yeah.
Right, and youth night actually does pretty effectively get people from both services together. I would say it's half and half probably.
That's good to know.
Yeah, so that, I think that's been good, but even there, Jen, who's preaching today, you know, has people at different tables. And I've seen a lot of people kind of self-segregating.
Clicks, little clicks. Well, that may have to do, that's the age. That may have a lot to do with the age.
Well, it does, and it
You
does,
do that.
it does,
Yeah.
and
It doesn't.
Part of that is the discomfort of interacting with people that you don't know very well, you know. So, and some of it is language, because there are a few of the students there that really are fairly new to this country and don't know English well.
They will be very quick to. pick up
Yeah,
the
right,
word.
right.
They have to, because they're being forced into it, even though it's English, which is so difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they also, they want to be able, they're the translators for the things.
Mhm.
And like Javier's mother, she spoke English before she moved to Spanish.
Yeah.
And they moved out of the city specifically for the boys to go to school.
Yeah. One of the things that like Seth is doing that I think is good is he's starting a little fire at the 1 o'clock service.
Good.
And there's only like 3 people so far really doing that, but I think that that's been, I think, you know, that's one way we kind of have in a way segregated those services too.
The music is different.
The music is different. I've heard from a number of people who, from the 1 o'clock service who live here in New Oregon, but they don't have, it was never played in the past, in the 1 o'clock service. So, you know, some of those kinds of things, might make a difference. I don't know. So let's just look at our last slide because this was on Facebook. I saw this on Facebook today and I loved this. I love the image because it's a Pentecost image. But the quote is from a book Howard Thurman wrote in 1961 called Mysticism and the Experience of Love. And it says, to love means dealing with persons in the concrete rather than in the abstract. In the presence of love, there are no types or stereotypes, no classes and no masses. To speak of love for humanity is meaningless. There's no such thing as humanity. What we call humanity has a name, was born, lives on a street, gets hungry, needs all the particular things that we need. There can be no love apart from suffering. Love demands that we expose ourselves at our most vulnerable point by keeping the heart open. And I think that brings us back to the idea of beloved community, of keeping the heart open to all those around us.
Thank you. What's next week?
So next week, we have the executive director from the Glen Ellen Pantry coming, and she's going to do kind of an experiential learning, I believe, where she'll guide us through the decisions that people have to make on how they're going to spend their money when they have very limited resources. So I think we'll understand. It gets us to understand more of the people who are in need of a food pantry and that we can help through what the food pantry is doing here in Glen Ellen.
Thanks to what you did there.
Yeah.
There was a time when the food pages in the Herald were doing a whole series on that. From a list of foods that a bunch of chefs or something say what we do with this to create a meal out of it. And we have to meet the challenge.
Yeah. Well, have you ever been to the Glen Ellen Food Pantry?
Oh, no.
Yeah. I was impressed with it when I saw all the, it's like a grocery store.
It's super. I'm really watching the construction of the new building.
Yeah. I don't know when it's gonna be done, do you?
They are working on the inside, and the inside is always the slowest part.
Yeah.
That's a really dumb question. Why aren't people coming to the Thursday night community?
Yeah.
The community dinner? Well, it's
Very low attendance.
it's
Really nice, and
it's a very nice thing.
it's pleasant to be there, and even if really, it's just, I
I
was
think-
surprised, I've only been there twice, and I've been so impressed.
I think there's Lynn. We were just talking about you, Lynn.
Yes.
We were just talking about you.
Yeah.
Because Diane said, why aren't people coming to the Thursday night community dinner? It's so nice, it's so lovely, it's so wonderful.
Yeah.
It's like we've got to get the word out. Like, I think it's like here. Why don't people come to this? I mean, it's like people, there are so many opportunities and people.
And the other thing too is we're finding for the Thursday night dinner that with summer coming on, it's hard to get volunteers. And so we're talking about taking a break with that for the summer and then pick it up again in September. Because people are away.
Yeah. It's, I think people are overcommitted.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also think that people, like getting volunteers, I think that the pandemic, people got accustomed to just being at home and not going out and doing things. And it's hard to get people back into
Exactly.
I can go help with this, or I can go do that. And so
But what we get in terms of volunteers.
Yeah, I talked to her twice about it as well.
What we get in terms of volunteers are new members.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Yeah. I know you had some really nice volunteers.
Great volunteers.
She's not looking.
Tell Laura,
Hi.
we can, I think we can get a dude.
Yeah, I gotta go do.
Yeah.
Cheerio, pip pip.
See you